The world's oceans are highways of commerce, migration, and adventure. But beneath the romance of sea travel lies a history written in steel, fire, and tragedy. For every tale of smooth passage, there are stories where fate, human error, and the relentless unpredictability of the sea have collided, sometimes literally, with catastrophic results. Tonight we journey through the most shocking ship collisions ever recorded. These are not just accidents, they are disasters that changed the course of maritime history, shattered families, and left entire nations in mourning. From the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster to a collision that leveled a city, these 5 stories are a chilling reminder that on the water, a single moment can alter thousands of lives. We begin in the Philippines, where a crowded ferry and an oil tanker met in darkness, sparking a firestorm that would claim more lives than the Titanic. Then we cross to the North Atlantic, where 2 luxury liners, each a marvel of modern engineering, misread the fog and collided with deadly consequences. In the frigid North Sea, a modern cargo ship vanishes in minutes after a routine crossing goes horribly wrong. We revisit Halifax, Nova Scotia, where a low-speed collision between 2 ships unleashed the largest man-made explosion before the atomic age, flattening a city and killing thousands. And finally, we witness the horror of the MV JOOLA, a Senegalese ferry so overloaded that its capsize became one of the worst maritime disasters in history. These are the stories of the DONYA PAZ, ANDREA, DORIA, BALTIC ACE, MONT-BLANC, and JOOLA. 5 collisions, 5 disasters, and a legacy of loss, heroism, and lessons learned at a terrible cost. It was December 20th, 1987, just 5 days before Christmas. Throughout the Philippine archipelago, families were preparing for the holidays, students were returning home from universities, and workers were traveling to spend the festive season with loved ones. The spirit of Christmas filled the air, and for thousands of Filipinos, the journey home would begin aboard the passenger ferry MV DONYA PAZ, making its routine overnight journey from Tacloban City on Leyte Island to Manila, the bustling capital of the Philippines. The DONYA PAZ was a familiar sight in Philippine waters, one of many inter-island ferries that served as the lifeline, connecting the scattered islands of the archipelago. Built in Japan in 1963 as the Himeyuri Maru, she had originally been designed as a passenger vessel for domestic Japanese routes. Over the years, she had changed hands, names, and purposes before eventually finding her way to the Philippines, where she was rechristened the DONYA PAZ and pressed into service on the vital Manila-Tacloban route. On paper, the vessel was licensed to carry 1,493 passengers and 59 crew members, a total of 1,552 souls. But in the Philippines of the 1980s, official passenger manifests were often more fiction than fact. The country's inter-island ferry system operated in a regulatory gray area where safety inspections were sporadic, enforcement was lax, and the economic pressures of serving a poor population often took precedence over strict adherence to safety protocols. As the DONYA PAZ prepared to depart Tacloban that December evening, the reality of her passenger load was far different from what her license permitted. Families crowded aboard with their Christmas shopping, their gifts, their hopes for a joyful reunion. Students, many of them young people in their teens and early 20s, packed the decks with their belongings, excited to return home for the holidays. Workers who had spent months away from their families pushed aboard with their hard-earned wages and presents for their children. Many passengers had no tickets at all. They were walk-on passengers who paid their fares in cash and were never recorded on any official manifest. Others had tickets, but found their assigned seats already occupied, forcing them to find space wherever they could. In corridors, on deck, even in spaces never intended for passengers. Later estimates would suggest that the true number of people aboard the DOña Paz that night was over 4,000, nearly 3 times the ship's legal capacity and far beyond any reasonable safety margin. The overcrowding was not merely a matter of too many people in too little space. It was a systematic failure that compromised every aspect of the vessel's safety systems. Life jackets, already in short supply, were locked away in storage compartments to prevent theft. Emergency exits were blocked by passengers and their belongings. The crew, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people aboard, had long since given up any pretense of maintaining order or enforcing safety protocols. Beneath the surface of routine, there were other warning signs that should have raised alarm bells. The DOña Paz had been cited for safety violations in the past, but these citations had been largely ignored or addressed with only cosmetic changes. The vessel's radio equipment was reportedly not functioning properly, meaning that in an emergency, the ship would be unable to call for help. The crew, while experienced in the routine operation of the ferry, had received little training in emergency procedures and were more accustomed to dealing with the daily challenges of overcrowding than with life-threatening situations. As the DOña Paz pulled away from Tacloban's pier that evening, most passengers were settling in for what they expected to be an uneventful overnight journey. Families spread blankets on the deck and prepared to sleep under the stars. Students gathered in groups, sharing stories and snacks. Children played games while their parents watched the lights of Tacloban fade into the distance. It was a scene repeated countless times on ferries throughout the Philippines. Ordinary people making an ordinary journey, trusting in the competence of the crew and the seaworthiness of their vessel. At the same time, another vessel was making its way through Philippine waters with its own cargo of danger. The MT Vector was a small oil tanker, flying under a flag of convenience and operating in the shadowy world of petroleum transport that served the energy needs of the Philippine Islands. Built in 1960, the Vector was showing her age, but she was still considered seaworthy enough to carry her deadly cargo, 8,800 barrels of gasoline and petroleum products destined for Caltex Philippines. But like the DOña Paz, the Vector was operating under conditions that would have alarmed any competent maritime authority. The vessel was technically unseaworthy, operating without a proper license, and sailing with a crew that lacked the qualifications and training necessary for safe operation. Most critically, the Vector was operating without a qualified lookout. The crew member whose job it is to watch for other vessels and potential hazards. In the busy shipping lanes of the Philippines, where hundreds of vessels of all sizes navigate in close proximity, the absence of a proper lookout was a recipe for disaster. The Vector's master was not properly certified for the vessel he was commanding, and the crew's understanding of navigation rules and collision avoidance procedures was questionable at best. The tanker was also carrying a cargo that made any accident potentially catastrophic. Thousands of gallons of highly flammable petroleum products that could turn a simple collision into an inferno. As the night of December 20th progressed, Both vessels continued on their respective courses through the Tabla Strait, a busy waterway that connects the central and southern Philippines. The Doña Paz was following her regular route, while the Vector was making her way toward her destination with her dangerous cargo. The sea was choppy, but not unusually rough for the season, and visibility was generally good despite the darkness. At 10:30 p.m., as most passengers aboard the Doña Paz slept or dozed in the warm tropical air, the ferry was nearing Dumali Point in the Tablas Strait. The vessel was maintaining her regular speed and following her established route, with most of the crew focused on the routine tasks of navigation and passenger management. Few would have noticed the lights of another vessel approaching from a different direction, the MT Vector, making her way through the same waters with her cargo of death. In the darkness of the tropical night, with both vessels operating under substandard conditions, and with crews that were inadequately trained for emergency situations, disaster was approaching with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. The two ships, each carrying their own burden of human lives and dangerous cargo, were on a collision course that would result in the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. The collision, when it came, was not the result of a single catastrophic failure, but rather the culmination of a series of smaller failures, oversights, and compromises that had been building for years. The Vector's lack of a proper lookout meant that her crew was not adequately monitoring for other vessels. The Doña Paz's overcrowded conditions meant that her crew was distracted by passenger management rather than focused on navigation. Both vessels were operating in a regulatory environment where safety was often subordinated to economic considerations. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the MT Vector struck the MV Doña Paz in what should have been a relatively minor collision. The impact itself was not particularly violent. Both vessels were traveling at moderate speeds, and the angle of collision was not especially severe. Under normal circumstances, such a collision might have resulted in some damage to both vessels, but would likely have been survivable for all aboard. But these were not normal circumstances. The Vector's cargo tanks, weakened by years of corrosion and inadequate maintenance, ruptured upon impact. Within seconds, thousands of gallons of gasoline and petroleum products began spilling into the water around both vessels. The volatile fumes from the spilled fuel created an explosive atmosphere that needed only the smallest spark to ignite. That spark came almost immediately. Whether it was caused by metal scraping against metal during the collision, an electrical short circuit, or simply the friction of the two vessels grinding against each other, the source of ignition was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that within moments of the collision, the spilled gasoline ignited, creating a massive fireball that engulfed both vessels and turned the surrounding sea into a lake of fire. The transformation from routine voyage to hellish nightmare took place in a matter of seconds. Passengers aboard the Doña Paz, many of whom had been sleeping peacefully just moments before, were awakened by a deafening explosion that shattered the night. The lights aboard the ferry flickered and died, plunging the overcrowded vessel into darkness. The acrid stench of burning fuel filled the air, and within moments, flames were racing across the water and climbing the sides of both ships. Panic swept through the decks of the Doña Paz like wildfire. Passengers, many still in their nightclothes, scrambled for exits that were blocked by other passengers, by luggage, by the debris of the collision. The crew themselves, caught off guard by the speed and severity of the disaster, ran in panic rather than providing the leadership and guidance that the situation demanded. There were no clear orders, no organized evacuation procedures, no systematic attempt to help passengers reach safety, just chaos, terror, and the growing realization that the ship was doomed. The few passengers who managed to reach the deck faced a horrifying choice that no human being should ever have to make: remain aboard a ship that was rapidly becoming an inferno, or jump into waters that were themselves on fire. The petroleum products floating on the surface had turned the sea into a burning hell, with flames dancing across the waves and thick, choking smoke rising into the night sky. Some passengers, driven by desperation and the instinct for survival, chose to jump. They leaped from the burning deck, clutching suitcases, life preservers, anything that might help them float. But many of these brave souls found themselves swimming through burning fuel, their clothes and hair catching fire, their lungs filling with toxic smoke. The very water that should have offered salvation had become another source of death. Others remained trapped aboard the DONYA PAZ as the fire spread throughout the vessel. The ship's corridors, already crowded beyond capacity, became death traps as passengers struggled to escape through passages filled with smoke and flame. Many were overcome by smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Others were trampled in the desperate rush to escape. Still others found themselves trapped in compartments with no way out, their cries for help lost in the roar of the fire and the screams of other passengers. The DONYA PAZ, her hull compromised by the collision and her superstructure consumed by fire, began to list heavily as water poured through the breach in her side. The combination of flooding and fire created a nightmare scenario where passengers faced death by drowning, burning, or smoke inhalation. Within 2 hours of the collision, the once proud ferry had slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the vast majority of her passengers and crew. The MT Vector, her cargo tanks ruptured and her crew, equally unprepared for the disaster they had helped create, burned for another 2 hours before she too succumbed to the flames and sank beneath the surface. The crew of the Vector, like their counterparts on the DONYA PAZ, had received little training in emergency procedures and were overwhelmed by the speed and severity of the disaster. Most perished in the flames or drowned in the burning sea. The first witness to the disaster was the crew of another ferry, the MV Don Claudio, which was following a parallel route several miles away. The crew of the Don Claudio reported seeing a massive explosion on the horizon, followed by a glow that lit up the night sky. Initially uncertain about what they had witnessed, the crew of the Don Claudio altered course to investigate, arriving at the scene of the disaster approximately 1 hour after the collision. What they found was a scene from hell itself. The sea was still burning in places, with patches of fuel continuing to ignite as they rose to the surface. Debris from both vessels was scattered across a wide area. Along with the bodies of passengers and crew members, many of them burned beyond recognition. In the water, a handful of survivors clung to pieces of wreckage. Their clothes burned away, their skin blackened by fire and oil, their voices hoarse from screaming and smoke inhalation. The crew of the Don Claudio worked frantically to pull survivors from the water, but the number of living victims was heartbreakingly small. Many of those they rescued were so severely burned that they died within hours of being brought aboard. Others were in such severe shock that they were unable to speak or even comprehend what had happened to them. The rescue operation continued through the night, but as dawn broke over the Tabla Strait, it became clear that the vast majority of those aboard both vessels had perished. The final count of survivors was devastating in its smallness. Just 26 people, 24 from the DOña PAZ and 2 from the Vector, were pulled alive from the water. Most were badly burned, traumatized beyond measure, and in critical condition. Many required extensive medical treatment for burns, smoke inhalation, and psychological trauma. The survivors' accounts of the disaster painted a picture of chaos, terror, and systematic failure at every level. It took 8 hours for Philippine maritime authorities to learn of the disaster, a delay that highlighted the inadequacy of the country's maritime safety and communication systems. The DOña PAZ's non-functioning radio meant that no distress signal was ever sent, and it was only when the Don Claudio reported the disaster that authorities became aware of what had happened. Even then, it took another 8 hours for organized search and rescue operations to begin. Far too late to save any additional lives. By the time government rescue vessels arrived at the scene, the sea had already begun to claim its victims. Bodies were scattered across miles of ocean, many of them burned or decomposed beyond recognition. The warm tropical waters and the presence of marine scavengers meant that many bodies were never recovered, leaving families without even the closure of a proper burial for their loved ones. The final death toll was staggering. 4,086 people lost their lives in the collision and fire, making it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in recorded history. The number exceeded even the legendary Titanic disaster by a factor of 3. Yet the DOña PAZ tragedy received relatively little international attention, perhaps because it occurred in a developing country and involved primarily poor passengers rather than wealthy international travelers. The aftermath of the disaster was a national tragedy that exposed the deep flaws in the Philippine maritime system. Families throughout the country waited for news that would never come, hoping against hope that their loved ones might have somehow survived. The government inquiry that followed revealed a litany of failures that had made the disaster not just possible, but virtually inevitable. The investigation found that the MT Vector was operating illegally, without proper licensing or certification. The vessel was technically unseaworthy and should never have been allowed to carry such a dangerous cargo. The crew lacked the training and qualifications necessary for safe operation, and the absence of a proper lookout violated basic maritime safety protocols. The DOña PAZ was found to be grossly overloaded, carrying nearly 3 times her legal capacity. Safety equipment was either missing, locked away, or inaccessible to passengers. The crew had received inadequate training in emergency procedures and had no plan for dealing with a disaster of this magnitude. The vessel's radio equipment was not functioning, making it impossible to call for help when disaster struck. The owners of both vessels were found to bear responsibility for the disaster, but the legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and complex. The owners of the Vector were ultimately held liable for damages, but for the survivors and families of the victims, no amount of money could compensate for their losses. Many felt that justice was never truly served, and that the systemic failures that led to the disaster were never adequately addressed. The DOña PAZ disaster left a permanent scar on the Philippines that endures to this day. It exposed the deadly consequences of lax regulation, systematic corner-cutting, and the treatment of poor passengers as expendable cargo. The tragedy led to some improvements in ferry safety and maritime regulation, but many observers argued that the changes were too little, too late. The disaster is sometimes called Asia's Titanic, but in truth, it eclipsed even the Titanic in the scale of its loss. Unlike the Titanic, however, the DOña PAZ tragedy has been largely forgotten by the international community, remembered primarily in the Philippines, where thousands of families still bear the scars of that terrible night. For the survivors, the disaster was a trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to travel by sea or even to speak about their experiences without reliving the terror of that night. The physical scars from burns and injuries were matched by psychological wounds that never fully healed. The DOña PAZ disaster stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when safety is sacrificed for profit, when regulations are ignored, and when the lives of ordinary people are treated as acceptable losses in the pursuit of economic efficiency. It is a tragedy that should never be forgotten, and a lesson that the maritime industry ignores at its peril. The North Atlantic Ocean, July 25, 1956. In the golden age of transatlantic travel, when crossing the ocean was still an event of glamour and significance, two magnificent vessels were approaching each other in the fog-shrouded waters south of Nantucket Island. Each represented the pinnacle of their nation's maritime engineering and the pride of their respective fleets. Neither crew could have imagined that within hours, one of these floating palaces would be resting on the bottom of the Atlantic, and the era of the great ocean liners would begin its inexorable decline. The Italian liner, SS Andrea Doria, was nearing the end of what should have been a triumphant voyage from Genoa to New York. She was more than just a ship. She was a floating symbol of Italy's post-war Renaissance, a testament to the nation's determination to reclaim its place among the world's great maritime powers. At 697 feet long and displacing over 29,000 tons, the Andrea Doria was one of the most beautiful and technologically advanced passenger ships ever built. Launched in 1951, the Andrea Doria represented the very best of Italian design and engineering. Her interiors were adorned with priceless works of art, including murals, sculptures, and mosaics created by Italy's finest artists. The ship featured 3 swimming pools, multiple restaurants serving cuisine prepared by master chefs, ballrooms where passengers danced to live orchestras, and luxurious suites that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. She was not merely a means of transportation, but a destination in herself, offering passengers an experience of unparalleled luxury and sophistication. On this particular voyage, the Andrea Doria carried 1,134 passengers and 572 crew members, representing a cross-section of international society. There were wealthy industrialists and their families returning from European vacations, immigrants seeking new lives in America, students, artists, diplomats, and business travelers. Among the passengers were celebrities, including actress Ruth Roman and her young son, who were returning to Hollywood after a European tour. The ship's passenger manifest read like a who's who of international society. There were Italian nobles, American millionaires, European intellectuals, and South American diplomats. Many were traveling in the ship's most luxurious accommodations, including the magnificent suites on the upper decks that offered panoramic views of the ocean and appointments that rivaled the finest hotels in the world. But the Andrea Doria was more than just a luxury hotel at sea. She was also a marvel of modern maritime technology, equipped with the most advanced safety features available in the 1950s. The ship featured radar systems for navigation in poor visibility, radio equipment for constant communication with shore stations and other vessels, and an innovative design that included 11 watertight compartments intended to keep the ship afloat, even if several were breached. The vessel's safety systems had been designed by some of Italy's finest naval architects, incorporating lessons learned from maritime disasters of the past, including the Titanic. The ship's designers were confident that they had created a vessel that was virtually unsinkable, capable of surviving even the most severe damage and bringing her passengers safely to port. As the Andrea Doria approached the end of her 9-day crossing from Genoa, passengers were already beginning to pack their belongings and prepare for their arrival in New York. Many gathered on deck to catch their first glimpse of the American coastline, while others enjoyed final meals in the ship's elegant dining rooms or relaxed in the lounges with cocktails and conversation. The ship's officers, led by Captain Piero Calamai, were experienced professionals who had guided the Andrea Doria safely across the Atlantic dozens of times. Captain Calamai was a veteran of over 40 years at sea, a man whose competence and judgment had been tested in countless situations. He was proud of his ship and confident in his crew's ability to handle any situation that might arise. But as the evening of July 25th progressed, the Andrea Doria entered a dense fog bank that had settled over the waters south of Nantucket Island. This was not unusual for the area, which was known for its unpredictable weather and frequent fog, but it required extra vigilance from the ship's officers. The radar systems were functioning normally, and the crew was following established procedures for navigation in reduced visibility. At the same time, approaching from the opposite direction was another magnificent vessel that represented the maritime heritage of a different nation. The MS Stockholm, flagship of the Swedish-American line, was beginning her return voyage from New York to Gothenburg, Sweden. Though smaller than the Andrea Doria at 525 feet long and 12,000 tons, the Stockholm was a ship of considerable distinction in her own right. Built in 1948, the Stockholm had been designed specifically for the North Atlantic route, with particular attention paid to the harsh conditions she would encounter during winter crossings. Her hull was reinforced for ice navigation, with a specially strengthened bow that could break through ice floes, a feature that would prove tragically significant in the events to come. The Stockholm carried 534 passengers and 208 crew members on this particular voyage. Like the Andrea Doria, her passenger list included a diverse mix of travelers, Swedish Americans returning to visit family in the old country, business travelers, tourists, and immigrants. The ship's accommodations, while not as opulent as those of the Italian liner, were comfortable and well-appointed, offering passengers a pleasant and safe crossing of the Atlantic. The Stockholm's captain was Gunnar Nordensson, but he was not on the bridge at the time of the collision. Command of the ship had been turned over to Third Officer Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, a 26-year-old officer who was relatively inexperienced in North Atlantic navigation. This transfer of command was routine. Captains could not be expected to remain on the bridge for the entire crossing, but it meant that at the crucial moment, the Stockholm was under the command of a junior officer. As the two ships approached each other in the fog, both were equipped with radar systems that should have allowed them to detect each other's presence and take appropriate action to avoid collision. The technology existed to prevent such disasters, and both crews were trained in its use. However, The interpretation of radar signals in 1956 required considerable skill and experience, and the systems were not as sophisticated or reliable as modern equipment. The ANDREA DORIA's radar detected the Stockholm at a distance of approximately 17 miles, appearing as a bright blip on the screen that indicated another vessel was approaching. The ship's officers plotted the Stockholm's course and speed, determining that the two vessels would pass safely if both maintained their current headings. This type of encounter was routine in the busy shipping lanes of the North Atlantic, and the crew had no particular reason for concern. However, the radar readings were subject to interpretation, and in the thick fog, visual confirmation of the other vessel's position and heading was impossible. The ANDREA DORIA's officers made course adjustments based on their understanding of the Stockholm's position and intended path, but these adjustments were based on assumptions that would prove tragically incorrect. Aboard the Stockholm, the radar operator and bridge officers were making their own calculations and assumptions about the ANDREA DORIA's position and intentions. The two ships were approaching each other at a combined speed of over 40 knots, which meant that the time available for course corrections was rapidly diminishing. In the fog, with visibility reduced to near zero, both crews were relying entirely on their radar systems and their interpretation of the other vessel's likely actions. The critical misunderstanding that led to the collision involved the assumptions each ship made about the other's intended course. The ANDREA DORIA's crew expected a standard port-to-port passing, where each ship would pass on the left side of the other. The Stockholm's crew, however, anticipated a starboard-to-starboard passing, where each ship would pass on the right side of the other. This fundamental miscommunication was compounded by the fog, which made visual confirmation impossible until the very last moment. Both ships made course adjustments based on their assumptions about the other's intentions, but these adjustments actually brought them closer together rather than farther apart. As the distance between the vessels decreased, the margin for error became smaller and smaller. At 11:10 p.m., with the fog still thick and visibility near zero, the two ships suddenly emerged from the fog bank and found themselves on a collision course with only moments to react. The officers on both bridges immediately realized the danger and attempted emergency maneuvers, but it was too late. The laws of physics and the momentum of two massive ships traveling at high speed made collision inevitable. The Stockholm's reinforced bow, designed for breaking ice, struck the ANDREA DORIA on her starboard side with tremendous force. The impact occurred at an angle, with the Stockholm's bow penetrating deep into the Italian liner's hull, opening a massive gash that extended through 7 decks. The collision was devastating, crushing passenger cabins, rupturing fuel lines, and causing immediate flooding in multiple compartments. The force of the impact was so great that it could be felt throughout both ships. Passengers who had been sleeping were thrown from their beds, while those still awake in the lounges and restaurants were knocked to the floor as the ships shuddered from the collision. The sound of the impact, a thunderous crash of metal against metal, was followed by the terrifying sounds of rushing water, breaking glass, and the screams of injured passengers. On the ANDREA DORIA, the damage was catastrophic and immediate. The Stockholm's bow had penetrated so deeply into the ship's side that several passenger cabins were completely destroyed, killing their occupants instantly. The ship's fuel tanks were ruptured, spilling thousands of gallons of oil into the sea and creating a fire hazard. Most critically, the collision had breached multiple watertight compartments, causing the ship to begin listing heavily to starboard. The ANDREA DORIA's innovative safety design, which was supposed to keep the ship afloat even with several compartments flooded, proved inadequate for the severity of the damage. The collision had created a breach so large and in such a critical location that the ship's stability was immediately compromised. Within minutes of the collision, the ANDREA DORIA was listing at a dangerous angle that made normal operations impossible. The listing of the ship created an immediate crisis for evacuation procedures. The ANDREA DORIA's lifeboats were mounted on both sides of the ship, but the severe list to starboard made it impossible to launch the boats on the port side. This meant that roughly half of the ship's lifeboat capacity was immediately unavailable, creating a potentially catastrophic situation for the more than 1,700 people aboard. Captain Calamet, awakened by the collision, immediately rushed to the bridge to assess the situation. What he found was every ship captain's worst nightmare. His vessel was taking on water rapidly, listing severely, and in immediate danger of sinking. The captain quickly realized that the ANDREA DORIA could not be saved, and that the only priority was the safe evacuation of all passengers and crew. The Stockholm, though heavily damaged in the collision, remained afloat and stable. Her reinforced bow had been crushed, and several crew members had been killed. But the ship's watertight compartments had contained the flooding and prevented her from sinking. The Stockholm's crew immediately began damage control procedures, while also preparing to assist in the rescue of the ANDREA DORIA's passengers and crew. One of the most remarkable aspects of the collision was the discovery of Linda Morgan, a 14-year-old American girl who had been sleeping in her cabin aboard the ANDREA DORIA when the collision occurred. The impact had thrown her from her bed and somehow deposited her, alive and relatively uninjured, on the Stockholm's crushed bow. She was found by the Stockholm's crew, confused and frightened, but miraculously alive, having been literally transferred from one ship to another by the force of the collision. The evacuation of the ANDREA DORIA began immediately, but it was complicated by the ship's severe list, the darkness, and the confusion that followed the collision. Many passengers were injured, some were trapped in their cabins, and others were simply too frightened or disoriented to make their way to the lifeboat stations. The ship's crew, though well-trained, faced unprecedented challenges in organizing an evacuation under such difficult conditions. The ANDREA DORIA's distress calls brought a rapid response from other vessels in the area. The French liner Île-de-France, under the command of Captain Raoul de Beaudillon, was approximately 44 miles away when she received the distress signal. Captain de Beaudillon immediately altered course and ordered his ship to proceed at maximum speed to the scene of the collision. The arrival of the Île-de-France transformed the rescue operation. The French liner was equipped with powerful searchlights that illuminated the scene, making it possible for rescue operations to continue through the night. The Île-de-France's crew launched their own lifeboats and worked alongside the Stockholm and other rescue vessels to evacuate passengers from the sinking ANDREA DORIA. The rescue operation was a remarkable display of seamanship, courage, and international cooperation. Ships of different nations worked together to save lives, with crews risking their own safety to help strangers in distress. The Île-de-France alone rescued over 750 people from the ANDREA DORIA, while the Stockholm and other vessels saved hundreds more. The evacuation continued through the night and into the early morning hours of July 26th. The ANDREA DORIA's list continued to increase, making it increasingly difficult and dangerous to launch lifeboats. Some passengers had to be lowered by rope into rescue boats, while others jumped into the water and were pulled to safety by rescue crews. Despite the heroic efforts of the rescue crews, not everyone could be saved. A total of 51 people lost their lives in the collision and its aftermath, 46 from the ANDREA DORIA and 5 from the STOCKHOLM. Most of the deaths occurred in the initial impact, when the Stockholm's bow crushed several passenger cabins on the ANDREA DORIA. Others died from injuries sustained during the collision or during the evacuation process. The last lifeboat left the ANDREA DORIA at 5:30 a.m. on July 26th, carrying the final group of passengers and crew members to safety. Captain Calamai was among the last to leave his ship, following the maritime tradition that the captain should be the last person to abandon a sinking vessel. At 10:09 a.m., nearly 11 hours after the collision, the ANDREA DORIA rolled over onto her side and slipped beneath the waves, coming to rest on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in 240 feet of water. The sinking of the ANDREA DORIA was witnessed by thousands of people aboard the rescue ships, and the image of the beautiful liner disappearing beneath the waves was captured by photographers and filmed by newsreel cameras. The dramatic footage of the ship's final moments was broadcast around the world, making the ANDREA DORIA disaster one of the first maritime catastrophes to be witnessed by a global television audience. The collision and sinking of the ANDREA DORIA shocked the maritime world and the general public. Here was a ship that represented the pinnacle of modern naval architecture and safety technology. Equipped with radar and other advanced systems, yet she had been lost in a collision that many believed should have been preventable. The disaster raised serious questions about the safety of ocean travel and the effectiveness of existing navigation and collision avoidance procedures. The investigations that followed the disaster were extensive and controversial. Both Italian and American authorities conducted inquiries, as did the International Maritime Organization. The investigations examined every aspect of the collision, from the radar readings and course changes to the decisions made by the officers on both ships. The investigations revealed that both ships had made errors in judgment and navigation. The ANDREA DORIA had been traveling at excessive speed for the foggy conditions, and her officers had misinterpreted the Stockholm's radar signature and course. The Stockholm had also been traveling too fast for the conditions, and her junior officer had made incorrect assumptions about the ANDREA DORIA's intentions. The disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations and procedures. New rules were established for navigation in fog, including mandatory speed reductions and improved communication protocols between ships. Radar training for officers was enhanced, and new technologies were developed to improve collision avoidance capabilities. The sinking of the ANDREA DORIA also marked a symbolic end to the golden age of transatlantic passenger travel. The disaster occurred just as commercial jet aviation was beginning to make ocean travel obsolete for most passengers. The combination of the tragedy and the growing popularity of air travel led to a rapid decline in the passenger liner industry. The wreck of the ANDREA DORIA, lying in 240 feet of water off Nantucket, became one of the most famous shipwrecks in the world. The relatively shallow depth made the wreck accessible to experienced divers, and over the years, thousands of artifacts have been recovered from the ship. However, diving on the ANDREA DORIA is extremely dangerous due to the depth, strong currents, and the deteriorating condition of the wreck, and several divers have lost their lives exploring the sunken liner. Today, the ANDREA DORIA serves as both a memorial to those who lost their lives and a reminder of the importance of maritime safety. The disaster demonstrated that even the most advanced ships and safety systems are only as good as the human beings who operate them, and that the sea remains an unforgiving environment where small errors can have catastrophic consequences. December 5th, 2012. The North Sea, that treacherous body of water between Great Britain and continental Europe, is living up to its fearsome reputation. 40 kilometers off the Dutch coast, in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, a winter storm is lashing the waters with winds reaching force 7 on the Beaufort scale. 3-meter waves roll across the sea's surface, driven by gusts that send spray flying across the decks of any vessel brave enough to venture into these conditions. The North Sea is no stranger to maritime tragedy. For centuries, it has claimed ships and lives with ruthless efficiency, earning a reputation as one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world. Its shallow depths, unpredictable weather, and heavy shipping traffic create a perfect storm of hazards that challenge even the most experienced mariners. On this particular December night, the sea is preparing to claim another victim. The MS Baltic Ace, a Bahamian-flagged car carrier, is making her way through these hostile waters on what should be a routine voyage from Zeebrugge, Belgium, to Kotka, Finland. The ship is a modern vessel, built in 2007 and representing the latest in automotive transport technology. At 179 meters long, and with a gross tonnage of 23,235, she is designed specifically for the transport of automobiles across the world's oceans. The Baltic Ace's cargo on this voyage consists of 1,400 brand-new Mitsubishi automobiles, fresh from the factory and destined for the Russian market. The cars are carefully secured on multiple decks within the ship's cavernous holds, each one representing someone's future transportation, someone's dreams of mobility and freedom. The cargo is valuable, worth millions of dollars, but more importantly, for our story, it represents the type of load that makes car carriers particularly vulnerable to certain types of maritime disasters. Car carriers like the Baltic Ace are marvels of modern engineering, designed to maximize the number of vehicles that can be transported in a single voyage. Their construction features large open cargo decks with minimal internal subdivision, a design that allows for efficient loading and unloading of vehicles, but creates significant safety challenges. Unlike conventional cargo ships with multiple watertight compartments, car carriers have vast open spaces that can flood rapidly if the hull is breached. The ship's crew of 24 men represents the international nature of modern shipping. The officers are primarily Filipino, while the crew includes sailors from various nations, all working together under the Bahamian flag of convenience. They are experienced professionals, well-trained in the operation of their specialized vessel, but they are about to face a situation that will test their skills and courage to the limit. Captain Sergei Loganov, a veteran mariner with years of experience in North Sea operations, is well aware of the challenges posed by the current weather conditions. The Baltic Ace is maintaining a steady course and speed, following the established shipping lanes that guide thousands of vessels safely through these crowded waters each year. The ship's radar systems are functioning normally, and the crew is maintaining the standard watches required for safe navigation. But the Baltic Ace is not alone in these treacherous waters. Approaching from a different direction is another vessel, that will soon play a tragic role in our story. The CORVUS J, a Cyprus-registered container ship making her way from Grangemouth, Scotland, to Antwerp, Belgium. The CORVUS J is also a modern vessel, built in 2011 and equipped with all the latest navigation and safety equipment. The CORVUS J, at 134 meters long and 8,827 gross tons, is smaller than the Baltic Ace but no less sophisticated in her design and equipment. She carries a mixed cargo of containers loaded with goods destined for European markets, everything from consumer electronics to industrial machinery. Like the Baltic Ace, she flies under a flag of convenience, a common practice in modern shipping that allows ship owners to take advantage of favorable regulatory and tax environments. The two ships are operating in one of the most congested shipping areas in the world. The North Sea serves as a highway for vessels traveling between the Atlantic Ocean and the ports of Northern Europe, including some of the busiest container ports in the world. On any given day, hundreds of ships of all sizes navigate these waters. Massive container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, passenger ferries, fishing vessels, and offshore supply boats serving the North Sea's oil and gas platforms. This heavy traffic, combined with the area's challenging weather conditions and relatively shallow waters, creates a complex navigation environment that demands constant vigilance from ship officers. The established traffic separation schemes help organize the flow of vessels, but they cannot eliminate the risk of collision, especially when weather conditions reduce visibility and make maneuvering more difficult. As the evening of December 5th progresses, both ships are following their planned routes through the designated shipping lanes. The weather is deteriorating, with increasing wind and waves making conditions more challenging for both vessels. Visibility is reduced by the storm, and both ships are relying heavily on their radar systems to maintain awareness of other traffic in the area. At approximately 6 o'clock p.m., the two ships begin to appear on each other's radar screens as they approach the same general area of the North Sea. This type of encounter is routine in these busy waters, and both crews begin the standard procedures for safe passing. The key to avoiding collision in such situations is clear communication, accurate assessment of each vessel's course and speed, and timely course adjustments to ensure safe separation. At 6:09 p.m., the CORVUS J makes a minor course adjustment to starboard to avoid another vessel in the area. This type of small course change is common in busy shipping lanes, where vessels frequently make minor adjustments to maintain safe separation from other traffic. However, this seemingly routine maneuver sets in motion a chain of events that will lead to disaster. The officer on watch aboard the Baltic Ace notices the CORVUS J's course change and, following standard maritime practice, attempts to establish radio contact to clarify the other vessel's intentions. The two ships communicate via VHF radio, the standard method for ship-to-ship communication in such situations. The conversation is brief and, on the surface, routine. Both crews believe they have reached an understanding about how they will pass each other safely. The agreement reached between the two ships seems straightforward. The Baltic Ace will make a slight turn to port, left, while the CORVUS J will maintain her current course. This type of arrangement is common and should result in the two vessels passing each other with adequate separation. However, as the minutes tick by and the ships continue to approach each other, confusion begins to mount about each vessel's actual position and intended course. The challenge of navigation in busy shipping lanes is compounded by the fact that ships are constantly making small course adjustments in response to other traffic weather conditions, and navigational requirements. What appears clear and simple on a radar screen can become confusing in practice, especially when multiple vessels are maneuvering in the same area and weather conditions are challenging. Both ships make additional small course adjustments as they continue to approach each other, each crew trying to anticipate the other's movements and ensure safe passage. However, these well-intentioned adjustments, combined with the challenging weather conditions and the stress of navigating in heavy traffic, create a situation where the two vessels are actually converging rather than diverging. The critical moments leading up to the collision unfold with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Both crews are aware of the other vessel's presence and are actively trying to avoid collision. But their efforts are hampered by miscommunication, misunderstanding of each other's intentions, and the challenging conditions that make precise navigation difficult. At 6:15 p.m., disaster strikes with sudden and devastating force. The CORVUS J's reinforced bow slams into the starboard side of the Baltic Ace at approximately a 45-degree angle. The impact occurs with tremendous force, as both vessels are traveling at significant speed, and their combined momentum creates a collision of devastating power. The CORVUS J's bow, designed to cut through waves and weather, proves equally effective at cutting through the Baltic Ace's hull plating. The collision creates a massive breach in the car carrier's side, opening her cargo decks to the sea and allowing thousands of tons of water to pour into the vessel's interior spaces. The impact is felt throughout both ships, throwing crew members to the deck and setting off collision alarms and emergency signals. On the Baltic Ace, the damage is immediately apparent. The ship begins to list heavily to starboard as water floods into her cargo holds. The vessel's design, optimized for carrying automobiles rather than surviving major hull damage, makes her particularly vulnerable to rapid flooding. Captain Loginov, awakened by the collision alarms, rushes to the bridge to find his ship in mortal danger. The Baltic Ace is taking on water at an alarming rate, and the list is increasing rapidly. The captain quickly realizes that his vessel cannot be saved and immediately orders the crew to abandon ship, a decision that will prove crucial to saving lives. The crew of the Baltic Ace has only minutes to escape their doomed vessel. The ship's severe list makes it difficult to launch lifeboats from the conventional davits, forcing the crew to deploy life rafts and emergency equipment under extremely challenging conditions. The storm continues to rage, with high winds and large waves making the evacuation even more perilous. Within just 15 minutes of the collision, the Baltic Ace capsizes completely and disappears beneath the waves, taking with her the 1,400 automobiles she was carrying and creating one of the most rapid sinkings of a large merchant vessel in recent maritime history. The speed of the sinking demonstrates the vulnerability of car carriers to flooding and the critical importance of immediate evacuation when such vessels suffer major hull damage. The CORVUS J, though heavily damaged in the collision, remains afloat and stable. Her crew immediately joins the search for survivors from the Baltic Ace, launching rescue boats and deploying emergency equipment to assist in the rescue operation. The container ship's survival demonstrates the importance of watertight subdivision in ship design. Her multiple cargo holds and watertight bulkheads prevent the flooding from spreading throughout the vessel. The rescue operation that follows is hampered by the severe weather conditions that continue to plague the North Sea. Winds are gusting to gale force. Waves are running 3 to 4 meters high, and the water temperature is near freezing. Conditions that make survival in the water extremely difficult and rescue operations extremely dangerous. Emergency services from multiple countries respond to the distress calls from the collision site. Helicopters from the Netherlands, Belgium, and the United Kingdom are dispatched to the scene, along with rescue vessels from various maritime authorities. The international nature of the response demonstrates the cooperation that exists among North Sea nations for maritime emergencies. The search and rescue operation continues through the night and into the following day, with aircraft and vessels scouring the area for survivors. The cold water and rough seas make survival time extremely limited for anyone in the water, creating urgency for the rescue efforts. 13 crew members from the Baltic Ace are successfully rescued from life rafts or plucked from the sea by rescue helicopters and vessels. However, the toll of the disaster is significant. 5 bodies are recovered from the water, and 6 crew members remain missing and are presumed dead. The loss of life, while smaller in absolute numbers than some maritime disasters, represents a significant tragedy for the families and communities affected by the sinking. The investigation into the collision reveals the complex factors that contributed to the disaster. While both ships were equipped with modern navigation and communication equipment, human factors played a crucial role in the accident. The investigation finds that miscommunication between the 2 vessels, combined with the challenging weather conditions and the stress of navigating in heavy traffic, created a situation where collision became inevitable. The Baltic Ace disaster serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of modern car carriers to rapid flooding and capsizing. The investigation leads to renewed discussions about the safety of these specialized vessels and the need for improved design standards that better balance cargo capacity with survivability in the event of hull damage. The accident also highlights the ongoing challenges of navigation in busy shipping lanes, where hundreds of vessels must coordinate their movements in confined spaces while dealing with weather, traffic, and the constant pressure of commercial schedules. Despite advances in navigation technology, the human element remains critical to safe navigation, and the potential for miscommunication and misunderstanding continues to pose risks. The wreck of the Baltic Ace remains on the seabed of the North Sea, along with her cargo of 400 automobiles that will never reach their intended destinations. The site serves as an underwater memorial to the crew members who lost their lives, and as a reminder of the ongoing dangers faced by merchant mariners in their daily work of keeping global commerce moving across the world's oceans. December 6, 1917. Halifax, Nova Scotia, awakens to what appears to be another routine morning in a city transformed by war. The Great War has been raging in Europe for over 3 years, and Halifax has become one of the most important ports in the British Empire's war effort. The harbor is crowded with vessels of every description: troop transports carrying soldiers to the Western Front, merchant ships loaded with supplies for the Allied forces, warships of the Royal Canadian Navy, and the constant stream of commercial traffic that keeps a nation at war supplied and functioning. The city itself has been transformed by its role as a crucial link in the Atlantic convoy system. Halifax's population has swelled with military personnel, dock workers, and the families of servicemen. The harbor, normally busy with the routine commerce of a major port, now pulses with the urgent rhythm of a nation at war. Ships arrive and depart at all hours, their holds filled with everything from grain and lumber to ammunition and explosives. Among the vessels in Halifax harbor on this fateful morning is the French cargo ship SS MONT-BLANC. a vessel whose name will soon be forever associated with one of the most devastating explosions in human history. The Mont-Blanc is not an impressive ship by the standards of her day. She is a modest cargo vessel, 320 feet long and displacing just over 3,000 tons. But what makes her remarkable, and ultimately deadly, is not her size, but her cargo. The Mont-Blanc has arrived from New York, where she was loaded with a cargo so dangerous that her crew was sworn to secrecy about its contents. In her holds and on her decks, the ship carries 2,125 tons of explosives and flammable materials destined for the war effort in France. The manifest reads like a recipe for disaster: 2,300 tons of picric acid, a highly unstable explosive used in artillery shells, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of benzol, a highly flammable liquid, and 10 tons of gun cotton, another powerful explosive. The ship's cargo is so dangerous that under normal circumstances, it would never be allowed in a busy harbor. The Mont-Blanc should have been escorted to a remote anchorage where her deadly cargo could be transferred to other vessels or transported by rail. But these are not normal circumstances. The demands of war have forced authorities to take risks that would be unthinkable in peacetime. Captain Aimé Lemedec, the Mont-Blanc's master, is acutely aware of the danger his ship represents. He has been given strict orders to avoid any risk of collision or fire, to maintain radio silence to avoid detection by German submarines, and to display no warning flags that might alert enemy agents to the nature of his cargo. The captain and his crew of 40 men know that they are sailing aboard what amounts to a floating bomb, and that the slightest spark could trigger a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The Mont-Blanc's presence in Halifax Harbor is part of the complex logistics of the convoy system that has been developed to protect Allied shipping from German U-boat attacks. Ships carrying valuable or dangerous cargoes gather in Halifax before joining convoys for the dangerous crossing of the Atlantic. The system has been largely successful in reducing shipping losses, but it requires the concentration of many vessels in a relatively small area, a situation that creates its own risks. As the Mont-Blanc prepares to enter the harbor's inner basin, where she will await the formation of her convoy, she must navigate through the Narrows, a confined channel that connects the outer harbor to Bedford Basin. The Narrows is barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point, and it serves as a bottleneck through which all traffic entering or leaving the inner harbor must pass. The navigation of the Narrows requires careful coordination between vessels, especially during the busy wartime period when traffic is heavy and schedules are tight. Ships entering the harbor have the right of way over those leaving, but this rule requires constant communication and cooperation between vessels to prevent conflicts and potential collisions. On this particular morning, as the Mont-Blanc approaches the Narrows, another vessel is preparing to leave Halifax Harbor on an urgent mission. The SS Imo is a Norwegian steamship that has been chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium to carry humanitarian supplies to the war-torn populations of occupied Europe. At 430 feet long and 5,000 tons, the Imo is larger than the Mont-Blanc and represents the international effort to provide aid to civilian victims of the war. The Imo is running behind schedule, having been delayed by bureaucratic complications related to her cargo and destination. Her captain, Håkon From, is anxious to make up lost time and reach New York, where the ship will load supplies for her humanitarian mission. The pressure to maintain schedules during wartime is intense. Delays can mean the difference between life and death for the people depending on the supplies these ships carry. As the IMO begins her journey down the harbor toward the Narrows, she is traveling faster than the harbor regulations permit. The speed limit in Halifax Harbor has been established for safety reasons, particularly to prevent accidents in the confined waters of the Narrows. But the pressure of wartime schedules often leads captains to push the limits of safe operation. The stage is now set for a collision that will have consequences far beyond the two vessels involved. The MONT-BLANC, loaded with explosives and approaching the Narrows from the sea, and the IMO, traveling at excessive speed and anxious to reach the open ocean, are on converging courses in the confined waters of Halifax Harbor. The rules of navigation in the Narrows are clear. Vessels entering the harbor have the right of way, and ships should pass port to port, left side to left side. However, the IMO finds herself on the wrong side of the channel, having been forced there by other traffic and her own excessive speed. When the two ships sight each other, they are already in a situation where collision avoidance will require precise communication and seamanship. The two ships exchange whistle signals, the maritime equivalent of a conversation about their intentions. However, the signals are misunderstood or misinterpreted, leading to confusion about each vessel's intended course. The MONT-BLANC's captain expects the IMO to move to her proper side of the channel, while the IMO's captain believes he has the right to maintain his current course. As the distance between the two ships decreases, the situation becomes increasingly critical. Both captains realize that collision is imminent and attempt emergency maneuvers, but the confined waters of the Narrows and the momentum of the two vessels make avoidance impossible. At 8:45 a.m., the IMO's bow strikes the MONT-BLANC's starboard side in what appears to be a relatively minor collision. Under normal circumstances, such a collision might have resulted in some damage to both vessels, but would not have been considered a major disaster. Ships collide with some regularity in busy harbors, and most such incidents result in nothing more than bent metal and insurance claims. However, the MONT-BLANC is not carrying a normal cargo. The impact of the collision ruptures several barrels of benzol stored on the MONT-BLANC's deck, spilling the highly flammable liquid across the ship's deck and into her cargo holds. The friction and sparks generated by the collision provide the ignition source, and within seconds, the spilled benzol erupts into flames. The fire spreads rapidly across the ship's deck and begins to work its way toward the holds containing the more powerful explosives. Captain Lemedek and his crew, knowing the deadly nature of their cargo, immediately recognize that their ship has become a floating bomb with a lit fuse. The captain orders the crew to abandon ship immediately, and the 40 French sailors launch their lifeboats and row frantically toward the shore, shouting warnings in French to anyone who will listen. However, their warnings are largely ignored or misunderstood by the English-speaking population of Halifax. To the people gathering along the waterfront to watch the spectacle of a burning ship, the MONT-BLANC appears to be simply another maritime accident, dramatic but not particularly dangerous. Hundreds of people, including many children, gather at windows, on rooftops, and along the harbor front to watch the burning vessel. The MONT-BLANC, now completely abandoned and burning fiercely, drifts with the tide toward Pier 6 on the Halifax waterfront. The fire continues to spread throughout the ship, and the heat begins to affect the explosive cargo in the holds. Unknown to the spectators gathering to watch, they are witnessing the final minutes before one of the largest explosions in human history. At exactly 9:04:35 a.m., the Mont-Blanc explodes with a force that defies description. The blast is equivalent to roughly 2,900 tons of TNT, making it the largest human-made explosion before the development of nuclear weapons. The explosion is so powerful that it is heard over 100 miles away, and the shockwave travels outward at supersonic speed, devastating everything in its path. The immediate area around the explosion is simply vaporized. The Mont-Blanc herself disappears completely, with pieces of the ship scattered over a radius of several miles. The ship's anchor, weighing over half a ton, is found 2 miles away. The explosion creates a mushroom cloud that rises over a mile into the sky, and the flash of the blast is visible from miles away. The devastation in Halifax is apocalyptic. Within a radius of 800 meters from the explosion, virtually every building is completely destroyed. The shockwave flattens wooden structures, bends steel rails like pretzels, and shatters windows up to 10 miles away. The pressure wave is so powerful that it strips bark from trees and kills birds in flight. The human toll is staggering. More than 1,780 people are killed instantly or die from their injuries in the hours and days following the explosion. Another 9,000 are injured, many of them blinded by flying glass, from the thousands of windows shattered by the blast. The explosion creates approximately 25,000 homeless people in a city whose total population was only about 50,000. The explosion also creates a tsunami that surges across Halifax Harbor, carrying away buildings, vehicles, and people who survived the initial blast. The wave, estimated to be over 60 feet high in some areas, adds to the destruction and loss of life. Ships in the harbor are lifted out of the water and deposited on shore, while others are sunk by the force of the wave. Among the most tragic aspects of the disaster is the number of children killed or injured. Many schools were in session when the explosion occurred, and the large windows that provided light for the classrooms became deadly projectiles when the shock wave shattered them. Entire families were wiped out, and many children were orphaned in an instant. The explosion also destroys much of Halifax's infrastructure. The railway station, several piers, numerous warehouses, and hundreds of homes and businesses are reduced to rubble. The city's ability to function as a port is severely compromised, affecting the war effort and the local economy. Communication lines are severed, making it difficult to coordinate rescue efforts, or even to inform the outside world of the scale of the disaster. The immediate aftermath of the explosion is chaotic and heartbreaking. Survivors wander through the ruins in shock, searching for family members and trying to comprehend the scale of the destruction. Fires break out throughout the devastated area, adding to the danger and hampering rescue efforts. The city's hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties, and medical supplies quickly run short. Rescue efforts begin immediately, but they are hampered by the destruction of the city's infrastructure and the onset of a severe blizzard that strikes Halifax the day after the explosion. The storm dumps over a foot of snow on the devastated city, making rescue work even more difficult and adding to the suffering of the homeless survivors. Help arrives from across Canada and the United States as word of the disaster spreads. Relief trains carrying medical supplies, food, and rescue workers are dispatched from cities throughout the region. The response demonstrates the solidarity and compassion that disasters often bring out in people, but it cannot undo the terrible damage that has been done. The investigation into the disaster examines every aspect of the collision and explosion. The inquiry finds fault with both ships. The MONT-BLANC for failing to display proper warning signals indicating her dangerous cargo, and the EMO for traveling at excessive speed and on the wrong side of the channel. However, the investigators also recognize that the disaster was the result of a series of unfortunate circumstances rather than criminal negligence. The legal proceedings that follow are complex and controversial. Various parties attempt to assign blame and seek compensation for the enormous losses suffered. However, the courts ultimately find that both ships bear responsibility for the collision, and no single party is held entirely liable for the disaster. The Halifax explosion leads to significant changes in maritime safety regulations, particularly regarding the transport and handling of dangerous goods. New rules are established for the segregation of explosive cargoes, the marking of dangerous vessels, and the coordination of harbor traffic. The disaster also leads to improvements in emergency response procedures and urban planning in areas near ports and industrial facilities. The explosion has a lasting impact on Halifax and its people. The city is rebuilt over the following years, but the scars of the disaster remain visible for decades. Memorials are erected to commemorate the victims, and the anniversary of the explosion becomes an annual day of remembrance. Many families carry the trauma of the disaster through multiple generations, and the explosion becomes a defining event in the city's history. The MONT-BLANC explosion serves as a stark reminder of the potential consequences of maritime accidents, particularly when dangerous cargoes are involved. The disaster demonstrates how a relatively minor collision can escalate into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions when proper safety procedures are not followed or when the risks of dangerous operations are not adequately managed. Today, the Halifax explosion is remembered as one of the worst disasters in Canadian history and as a cautionary tale about the importance of maritime safety. The story of the MONT-BLANC and the EMO reminds us that the consequences of accidents at sea can extend far beyond the vessels involved, affecting entire communities and changing the course of history. September 26, 2002, the port of Ziguinchor in southern Senegal pulses with the familiar rhythm of West African commerce and travel. The air is thick with humidity and the scent of the Casamance River, which flows past this regional capital toward the Atlantic Ocean. In the gathering dusk, hundreds of people crowd the waterfront, their belongings piled high, waiting to board the government ferry that serves as their lifeline to the rest of Senegal. The MV JOOLA, named after the Diola people of the Casamance region, sits at the dock like a patient beast of burden, ready to carry her human cargo on the 18-hour journey north to Dakar, the nation's capital. For many of the passengers gathering at the port, this ferry represents more than mere transportation. It is their connection to opportunity, education, family, and the wider world beyond their isolated southern region. Senegal's geography makes the JOOLA's service essential. The Casamance region is separated from the rest of the country by the Gambia, a narrow nation that cuts into Senegal like a finger pointed toward the Atlantic. This geographical quirk, a legacy of colonial boundary drawing, means that travel between southern Senegal and the capital requires either a long, expensive journey by road through Gambian territory or passage by sea aboard the JOOLA. The ferry herself is a roll-on, roll-off vessel, built in Germany in 1990 and designed to carry both passengers and vehicles. At 79 meters long and with a gross tonnage of 2,932, she is a substantial vessel by regional standards. but her design reflects the economic realities of West African ferry operations, rather than the luxury standards of international passenger shipping. The JOOLA is functional rather than beautiful, built to maximize capacity and minimize operating costs. According to her official certification, the JOOLA is licensed to carry 536 passengers plus crew and vehicles. This capacity was determined based on international safety standards that take into account the vessel's stability, life-saving equipment, and emergency procedures. However, like many ferries operating in developing countries, the JOOLA routinely carries far more passengers than her official capacity allows. On this particular September evening, the reality of the JOOLA's passenger load bears little resemblance to her official capacity. As many as 2,000 people crowd aboard the ferry, nearly 4 times her legal limit. The passengers represent a cross-section of Senegalese society, students returning to universities in Dakar after visiting family in the south, traders carrying goods to sell in the capital's markets, civil servants traveling on government business, families visiting relatives, and tourists exploring the country's cultural heritage. The sea is unforgiving. It remembers every mistake, every oversight, every moment of hubris. The collisions we have witnessed tonight, DONYA PAZ and Vector, ANDREA, DORIA and Stockholm, BALTIC ACE and CORVUS J, MONT-BLANC and IMO, the JOOLA, are more than accidents. They are tragedies born of human error, complacency, and the relentless unpredictability of the ocean. Each disaster brought unimaginable loss, but also hard lessons. The DONYA PAZ exposed the deadly consequences of overloading, poor regulation, and inadequate safety measures. The ANDREA DORIA showed that even the most advanced technology cannot replace caution and clear communication. The BALTIC ACE reminded us that in busy shipping lanes, a single misjudgment can be fatal. The Mont-BLANC explosion taught the world about the dangers of hazardous cargo and the need for strict protocols. The JOOLA laid bare the deadly price of neglect, corruption, and indifference to human life. Yet in the midst of these tragedies, there were moments of heroism. The passengers and crew who risked their lives to save others, the rescuers who braved fire and storm, and the survivors who carried the memory of the lost. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Maritime disasters are not just tales of the past. Ships still collide, ferries still capsize, and the sea remains as unpredictable as ever. But each disaster leaves a legacy, a call for vigilance, for better training, for stricter regulation, and for a culture of safety that values every life. As we end our journey through the most shocking ship collisions ever recorded, let us remember the lessons paid for in blood and tears. The ocean is vast and beautiful, but it demands respect. For those who travel upon it, and for those who wait on distant shores, the price of complacency is always too high.